Far up along the northeast of Delaware, in the center of the Delaware River, is the mile-long Pea Patch Island. It's a national park with historical relevance because of the old Civil War fort that resides there. It was one of 3 forts that was crucial in defending Philadelphia during the war, and was where the Union soldiers kept their Confederate prisoners after Gettysburg. Today it's publicly accessible by tourist ferries from both sides of the river. Most of the tours are more focused on the island's historical significance than anything supernatural, but the island does have a history of ghostly incidents. It was featured in a season 4 episode of Ghost Hunters, and has a limited number of paranormal tours during the fall. During the tour, I was darting around looking into every corner of the fort. The tour guide commented on how brave I was compared to most other kids, who tended to be very reluctant to explore the fort after dark. Looking back though, I don't think that it was just me being a hyperactive kid. I remember the feeling of tension right at the very back of my conscious mind. Kind of like the feeling that you get when you're walking across a frozen lake, when you know the ice could suddenly start cracking beneath you. I kept running ahead because I felt that there was something there, idling at the very back of the group. Something unnatural that I was trying to avoid. I wasn't exactly panicking, but I knew that I didn't want to fall far behind. I wanted to stay as far away from the feeling as possible. Sometimes when we stopped and the group clustered, I would feel my stomach drop, as if sensing that something was getting closer. I kept tugging at my mom, asking her to keep moving, even if the tour group was still settled, because that feeling of a stalker closing in on me would continue to grow. Now in retrospect, if that was the worst of it, I supposed I could have just dismissed it as a nervous child's discomfort in a scary, somewhat confined space. But that's when it got worse. We descended some steps to an area where some of the prisoners were kept in solitary confinement. The rooms were incredibly small, and it was very dark and claustrophobic. I saw the other adults walking in and out with ease, but I couldn't bring myself to take a step forward. I felt cold, like something was holding me back, preventing me from entering. My mother tried to coax me in, but I just stood there like a pillar, refusing to budge. Something was in the cell in front of me, and it was angry. I could feel its rage and its desire to strike out at someone. It wasn't a nervous suspicion. It was a genuine feeling, like the subtle vibration happening around you when you're riding in an elevator. And then I felt a presence behind me, breathing down my neck. I couldn't bring myself to move in either direction, so I sank down into a crouched position. I took one last look before closing my eyes and saw 2 dark shadows towering over me. I fought back tears until my dad came and got me. I suddenly felt sick to my stomach and wanted nothing more than to leave the island. As we were leaving the fort, I shut my eyes and refused to peek as the sensation of something following us was still there, very close. That night I had a nightmare that I was cold and hungry and crammed into a small space with several others. It wasn't until I was older that it clicked in my head that the dream was likely the sensation the prisoners of war felt when they were crammed into those small cells. I believe that some people are more susceptible to others when it comes to picking up on paranormal entities, and children especially. I think I felt at least 2 spirits that day when I visited Fort Delaware, and they both knew it. I've been fascinated in the paranormal for several years now, and I wonder if I were to ever return to the island, if those same 2 spirits would remember me. About 9 years ago, a friend and I used to go to this caravan site on the beach a couple of miles up the coast from where I used to live. One year, a couple of months after the summer crowds had left, we had gone to a bonfire on site just to hang out and enjoy the festivities. We ended up staying up late, just wondering about the site before finally calling a taxi and waiting for it by the street, near the edge of a cliff. It had quieted down there quite a bit, but there were still a few people about. After a couple of minutes of us just standing there, I noticed something over by the cliff's edge, around 30 yards away. It looked like the start of a fire, but I didn't see anybody nearby. I pointed it out to my friend. I remember saying, "What's that?" And I think his response was something along the lines of, "Is someone actually building a fire right by the edge?" We continued to watch as the fire grew, and something blue became apparent in its center. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but it quickly materialized into what appeared to be a man in a blue boiler suit with shoulder straps, wearing a tan cowboy hat and an orange shirt, and he was digging hard into the ditch. I turned to my friend with an expression on my face I'm sure read, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" We didn't move or call out to the figure as he continued to dig. At first I was convinced that it was some kind of hologram, but there was actual dirt being shifted by his feet. At some point, when only his torso was visible, the image seemed to evaporate, and the fire quickly following suit. My friend and I just stood there in astonished silence, and I kept waiting for him to ask me if I wanted to go check out the hole. Maybe he was waiting for me to ask the same thing, but I didn't want to go anywhere near it. We didn't speak about it during the ride home, but I did bring it up to him the following day, and he lied right to my face and pretended that he hadn't seen anything, and that I was talking nonsense. I figure that some people just will not believe in ghosts no matter what they see. This sighting occurred at the Caravan Site in Tunstall, near the city of Hull in England. I spoke about this once to a different friend, who asked me if I ever considered that it might not have been a random sighting, but an omen regarding my future. I don't know what to believe. Frankly, I just wish I could return to the time before I saw it, and warn myself not to wait for the taxi by the cliff. Back in 1987, I was living in a house in Atlanta with 4 roommates. Over the course of the year, we had several experiences which eventually convinced us that something paranormal resided there with us. The house was well over 100 years old, having been built sometime just after Atlanta had been burned and destroyed by Union forces during the Civil War. It was a beautiful old Victorian home, located in an area known as Inman Park. We were all in our 20s, and trying to get started in our respective careers, so the prospect of sharing the rent for a 2-story, 5-bedroom house with a full basement was an attractive one. 1 week after moving in, we were all asleep in our rooms when we were awakened by the screaming of our roommate, Hannah. It was around 3 o'clock in the morning. We all jumped out of bed and ran to her room. She was sitting up in bed, sobbing about how she had woken up to see a dark figure standing next to her bed. She said that when she had screamed, the figure had simply turned and walked out of the room, though she couldn't recall the door opening until we had entered. Myself and the other male roommates immediately searched the house, but were unable to locate any intruder or find any sign of a break-in. After Hannah eventually calmed down, everybody went back to bed. The following morning, we tried to convince her that it only had been a nightmare, but she insisted that she had been fully awake and her mind would not be swayed. She refused to be left alone in the house after that. About 2 weeks later, we were all awoken by a loud crash from outside in the hall. All 5 of us ran out of our bedrooms to discover that a full-length mirror that had been mounted on the bathroom door had fallen and shattered to pieces all over the floor. We couldn't figure out how it had been dislodged, as the frame itself was still securely fastened to the door, and only the glass itself had fallen. We ruled out earthquakes or tremors caused by traffic, and for the sake of being able to return to sleep, we concluded that the glass had not been properly fitted into the frame, and the constant opening and shutting of it had never produced so much as a shudder. We swept up the glass and returned to bed. Later, similar activity would manifest itself in other ways. There was an instance when I was home alone, watching television, when 3 candles that were just sitting on the fireplace mantel suddenly fell onto the floor, almost as if someone had swept them forcefully off with a hand. Then there was the phenomenon that we all experienced at one time or another, where personal objects would randomly go missing. On one occasion, missing car keys were found lying right in the middle of the person's bed, after having just set them down in the kitchen. Other strange activity came in the form of knocking and tapping sounds we heard coming from the downstairs pantry or the garage in the dead of night when we all were accounted for. The last incident involved an actual sighting and occurred about 2 months after we had moved in. We were having a small party at our place, and a house guest, who none of us had met prior to the party, was taking a personal tour of our place on her own. She suddenly came running from downstairs, saying that she had just seen a man standing in the corner of the basement. She said that when she called out to him, he simply vanished through the wall. We immediately went down to the basement to check, and of course, found nobody there. What was the most interesting about the situation was that there was only one entrance into the basement, and anyone trying to escape would have been seen. Most of the guests blew off the incident as a joke, but the 5 of us who lived there felt uneasy. About a half year later, things seemed to quiet down, and no more ghostly activity was noticed. We began to convince ourselves that maybe we had all overreacted to some degree, and perhaps we were all just being overly imaginative about the whole thing. Finally, toward the end of our time living in the house, my girlfriend and I were out at a restaurant and happened to strike up a conversation with another couple sitting at a table nearby. When they asked us where we were living in Atlanta, we told them about our place in Inman Park. They responded with, "Oh my God, we used to live at that exact same house ourselves," and immediately followed by the woman asking without a hint of sarcasm or humor, "Have you seen the ghost yet?" We ended up comparing notes with them, and they told us about the many strange happenings they had witnessed in the house that were quite similar to our own. That experience thoroughly convinced me that there really is something to the whole subject of ghosts and the afterlife, and I no longer dismiss similar stories that I hear from other people regarding possible hauntings. This past Christmas Eve, my family experienced something, if not paranormal, certainly strange and terrifying. My mother recently purchased a double-wide trailer, and we all decided to spend Christmas Eve with her in her new home. I made sure to bring along my brass bottle opener from home, unsure if my mom had one available at her place for opening drinks. Determined not to lose it, I placed it in a cell phone case and set it on top of the microwave, which sat on the corner of the counter. After presents had been exchanged, my 2 adult brothers and myself gathered in the guest bedroom, right off of the living room to play some video games, while my mother, sister, and sister-in-law remained in the living room watching a movie. About 10 minutes into our game, I heard the faint sound of clattering, followed by the muttering words being exchanged by my family in the next room. A moment later, my sister started screaming my name, demanding that I come out into the living room. I paused the game and entered the room to discover my younger sister visibly shaken and asking where I had placed my bottle opener. Confused, I replied that it was in a cell phone case on top of the microwave. My sister then pointed towards the spot on the counter, about 6 inches away from the microwave. My bottle opener was lying out on the surface, while the cell phone case still sat on top of the microwave. My mother and sister explained that they had heard something clattering across the counter and were confused as to what had caused the noise, as they had been sitting within arm's reach. My hyperventilating sister explained to me that out of the corner of her eye, she had seen the bottle opener bounce across the counter and then come to a halt. This greatly confused me, because the force required to knock over the bottle opener as far away as it landed, without also knocking over the cell phone case, which, as I said, hadn't been disturbed at all. No one had knocked into the counter, and there hadn't been any kind of tremor or vibration that could have shifted it, because several other things would have fallen over as well. At a loss for an explanation, we concluded that our departed grandfather, who passed away 8 months ago, may have had something to do with it. The house was filled with furniture and personal belongings that had previously belonged to him. She recalled an instance earlier where a decorative plate had fallen from the wall and rolled perfectly across the floor and bumped into one of my grandfather's old paintings. Another explanation is that something else unseen could be residing in the house. I guess we'll have to wait and see what else occurs. So my grandfather has this old bayonet from the Civil War preserved in glass up on his mantle. He said his father had found it on their property back in the 1920s. It has rust all over it, obviously, but it also has these ancient blood stains. I asked him once if he thought it was blood from the Civil War. He shook his head and showed me a scar on his hand and said the blood was his. He proceeded to tell me this story. When he was much younger, he had gotten into a vicious fight with his brother over money, Intending to seriously harm his brother, he grabbed the bayonet from where it sat on my great-grandfather's desk and tackled his brother in the backyard. The two of them beat at each other with their fists, and when his brother rolled over on top of him, the bayonet, still clutched in my grandfather's hand, cut him pretty bad. They needed to have a doctor come to the house and bandage his hand, and afterwards he had needed to go to the hospital for stitches. That was bad enough, my grandfather told me, but the dreams that came afterwards were even worse. He said that for weeks afterwards, he had dreams about being a Civil War soldier and being shot directly in the gut by one of his fellow soldiers, and then stabbed repeatedly with a bayonet as he lay helpless upon the ground. He had woke up every night sweating and shaking at the intensity of the dream, and would be too frightened to fall back asleep. He said he was plagued with nightmares of being murdered on and off for several years, long after the wound on his hand had healed. Then he said when he was in his 20s, one night he awoke from the same dream, clutching his chest and gasping for air, when he saw a figure in the room with him. By the light of the early morning dawn, creeping in through the window, he saw a man in a Union soldier's uniform standing across the room looking at him. My grandfather said he blinked and started to yell at the man, but when he opened his eyes again, the figure was gone. The story fascinated me, and I asked my grandfather if he saw the figure again. He said he has seen him almost every day of his life since. No matter where he goes, the soldier is usually standing over him when he wakes up. He said the soldier only died once, but in the dream, he has been murdered hundreds of times. I suddenly heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, which frightened me, because I knew that we were alone in the house. I leapt to my feet and exclaimed, "What was that?" My grandfather looked at me and calmly replied, "That was him." The following story is told from the point of view of a female. These events happened when I was ages 9 through 14. I'm 25 now, so it's been a while. My family had recently moved into a new home. I really did love that house, but I've had the most terrifying paranormal experiences of my life there. It started with small things, like the feeling of being watched, to things turning up missing and showing up where I hadn't left them. Later, the TV would turn on and off at random, or the channel would change. One night I was hanging out with my brother in his room, watching him play Super Mario Bros. When his strobe light suddenly turned off, it then flashed rapidly as me and my brother stared at it in confusion. I got up to cut it off and sat back down, not thinking much of it. A few minutes later, it started flashing again. I got up once again and reached for the plug. I then stopped in my tracks and gasped. The light wasn't even plugged into the wall. I then threw the light into my brother's closet. I should mention that during the summers I would often be alone, as both of my parents and brother worked during the days. My neighbor would check up on me every now and then, but besides that I was alone from about 7 in the morning to around 4 in the afternoon. I would constantly see dark shadows moving out of the corner of my eyes, and I started to get bad anxiety. One morning I walked into the hallway that connected 3 of the rooms and one of the restrooms. At the end of the hallway I noticed a small dark mass that looked like some kind of fucked up dog. It then turned its head towards me, revealing 2 large glowing red eyes that pierced right through me. I stood frozen with fear until the figure ran into my parents' room. After a few seconds of just standing there, I slowly walked to the end of the hallway and pushed open my parents' door. There was nothing there. Feeling a bit freaked out, I went into the kitchen to make something to eat and calm my nerves. I reached towards the drawer to get a knife. The bottom cabinet swung open with so much force that when it hit my knee, I fell, yelling in pain. I was so upset that I didn't want to eat anymore. I felt so scared and alone. I decided to take a shower instead. I ran a hot shower and just sat in the tub trying not to cry. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my left shoulder. I felt my heart drop, and I stood up in shock and looked around the shower. There was nothing there. I pulled back the shower curtain. Nothing. I finished my shower and climbed out. As I put on my towel, I looked up at the mirror, and to my absolute horror, written in the steam read,
"You are not alone."
I started crying. I went to my neighbor's house until my parents came home. That weekend, my friend Liz spent the night with me. We stayed up late, and after everyone went to sleep, we sat in my bed talking about guys and school. Liz was in the middle of a sentence when we heard a knocking in the hallway. It sounded like someone was running up and down the hallway and banging on the walls. I thought it was my brother trying to scare us, so I got up to tell him off. I grabbed my doorknob and tried opening the door, but it was locked. "Did you lock my door?" I asked Liz. "No," she responded nervously. I unlocked it and opened my door. I turned on the hallway light and looked around. All the doors in the halls were closed, including the one leading into the living room towards my brother's room, and the hall was empty. I closed my door and told Liz there was no one there. I sat back down, and we started to talk about what it might have been. I was telling her everything that I have experienced in the house. Then she suddenly jumped and screamed. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Something just grabbed my shoulder." As I was telling her that I had felt that before too, I then felt the familiar grab on my shoulder. This time I tried to keep my cool, as the grip slowly faded, and nothing else happened that night. Needless to say, she never spent the night again. Things continued to escalate after that, from hearing voices to the floor creaking at night, and much more. I never told anyone because I didn't want to sound crazy. I moved out of the house at the beginning of my freshman year of high school. It's been years since I've lived there. I now live with my boyfriend about 10 minutes away from my old house, and every time I pass by that house, it still gives me the chills.
There's always a reason.